Photographic Composition, Lecture 5, the Digital Darkroom, Part 1. Most of the photographs that we've been discussing up to this point have been unmanipulated. That is to say that film was exposed to a scene and then processed with the intention of making prints from it that as faithfully represented the scene as possible. Man Ray was an artist who didn't feel that kind of constraint and often manipulated his imagery, and also often did it very simply. In this case, he took one photograph of the back of a woman and exposed that to photographic paper. Before processing it, though, he then exposed it a second time to an image of the F-holes in a violin, with the intention of playing up the similarities between the female form and the violin. From the very earliest days, there was a fair amount of manipulation required based on the processes that were available, the film and the processes that were available to photographers. In this instance, an ocean scene by Gustave Le Gray. The sky would have normally turned almost white because the early emulsions were very blue sensitive, and skies would often turn out absolutely white or very, very pale without any detail. And it was important to him in this particular image to show detail not only in the ocean but also in the sky. This required manipulation of the print in the darkroom. Here we have, unless you choose to believe that this is in fact a photograph of a two-headed man, an early example of deliberate manipulation. It's clear that the first image was taken with the man tilting his head either to the left or the right, and then it was exposed a second time after he had tilted it to the opposite side, thus giving us this kind of crude notion of a two-headed person. There were photographers who specialized in allegorical scenes and also ones that tended to be rather complex. Henry Peach Robinson was well known for this, and most of his images required at least 3, 4, 5, and more original negatives, which were then, in a relatively laborious process, brought together in a composite. This is a typical scene. Very likely the woman on the left was photographed separate from the women on the right, and the man at the window was probably yet another exposure. The sky might have been a separate exposure as well, all in support of this notion of an unreal reality. Eugene Ache, we've discussed Ache quite a bit, tried to anyone's knowledge only once achieve a double exposure here. The intention was to give detail to the sky, but it apparently didn't really, it wasn't something that Ache ultimately ended up believing in, because this is the only one of its kind that anyone knows of. And as you can see, it's extremely crude. It's obvious where the manipulation has taken place, and it doesn't reveal anything meaningful or useful in the process. This was very much like the daguerreotype of the gentleman who had moved his head from the left to the right to give the illusion of a two-headed man. Here, the photographer Maurice Gibert had Henri Toulouse-Lautrec pose twice, and then took the two images and melded them together in this one relatively convincing scene. F. Hollanday was also, for lack of a better term, an allegorical photographer who often combined images. Here we see a sort of idyllic woodland scene with a very large head seeming to come out of the side of the hill as if it were a natural form. And there's a lot of satire in photography involving primarily, or often involving scale. In this case, we have a huge, I believe it's a, well, these are European soldiers, and the one who was, there's one figure who's dominating the other three, partly because he's twice as big as anyone else. And again, this is relatively convincingly done, aside from the fact that it obviously could not happen. Man Ray again, as I mentioned before, he manipulated a lot of his images. In this case, there's actually not a lot of manipulation. In essence, what he has done is to make a positive and a negative print from the same image and flipped the negative to place the mask on opposite sides and then mounted these two together. This is a process called solarization that Man Ray also engaged in to some degree. In solarization, either the film or the print, when processed, are exposed to light briefly. And in the process, darks can go white or bright. It's kind of unpredictable, and I think that's part of what Man Ray actually enjoyed about the process, because he wasn't always sure what he was going to get, but he felt it was always going to be something interesting and worth engaging in. This is a photogram, also by Man Ray, and we can see it's two profiles apparently kissing, and hands, and some other objects have been photographed, maybe a pillow. It's hard to tell exactly what it is that we're looking at, and that's not the point. This is all about manipulation, and very deliberate manipulation. William Mortensen was also an allegorical photographer, an American in the working primarily in the 20s and 30s, and worked out a process that resembled drawing quite accurately in service of these biblical and other historical references, many of them gory as this is. This is also fairly typical of the work that he did, in which a number of images were brought together and altered one way or another. Here we see a picture of William Randolph Hearst, who was largely reviled, especially among artists, as somebody who had too much power in the press, since he owned a lot of it in the US. And here he's depicted as an octopus. Barbara Morgan also was interested in manipulation, and but she had also photographed a lot of dancers. So here you have an image of dancer, kind of faintly seen in the dark section of this, with flowers seen in silhouette, and scenes of more than likely Central Park seen in snow. John Heartfelt was a German photographer who was not shy about making political statements with his work, and made a whole series of photographs basically denouncing Nazism and Adolf Hitler in particular. This is another of Heartfelt's political satires. Weegee, who was also known as the Famous, whose name was, actually was Arthur Fellig, aside from being a news photographer in New York primarily, also engaged in a fair amount of darkroom trickery. In this case, he'd taken a picture of Betty Davis and played with it until he ended up with her having 4 eyes instead of 2. And Marilyn Monroe was also subjected to some of his trickery. In this case, it's my guess that perhaps he projected the negative through a distorting lens or some other device in order to give the very peculiar looking image on the right instead of the original on the left. Philip Osman was a photographer who specialized primarily in portraiture. He collaborated with Salvador Dali many times, and this is one of his best known collaborations, in which there is apparently no darkroom trickery, or at least very little. All of what you see in the frame was actually either suspended from the ceiling, or in the case of the cats in the water, thrown through the air. And because he was photographing with strobes, action was stopped in midair, and everything is clear. This print actually shows more information than would end up in the final print, but this is actually more interesting. I think we see that the chair is actually just being held by an assistant, and you can see above the easels and the pictures that there are wires suspending the easels. And the cats are on their own, though. They were actually thrown and wet at the time.